Putin has taken a huge amount of punishment. And as you rightly say, if he's going to have to start recruiting now from sort of first-tier cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, where it could begin to damage his popularity, then he's going to be reluctant to do so. And with his vast losses, he needs a pause, really. But, we all need to bear in mind in the West, it will be a pause we're talking about. Putin did not invade Ukraine to get 18% of Ukraine. He invaded Ukraine to get, if possible, 100% of Ukraine. That's why he invaded up directly into Kyiv, rather than from the east.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by Tim Willasey-Wilsey, a visiting professor of war studies at King's College London and a former British diplomat. Tim, it's always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Good to see you, James.
First of all, I wonder who, in your opinion, of Russia and Ukraine needs peace talks more urgently, because it strikes me you could almost argue it both ways. Do you have a view on who needs peace talks more urgently?
I think Ukraine needs peace talks more urgently. I think the manpower problems they've been experiencing over the past year, the fact that they're gradually losing territory, gradually, but nonetheless losing territory up in the Kharkiv region, in the Donbass region, I think they will breathe a huge sigh of relief if there can be a pause. That said, Russia's been taking huge amounts of punishment as well. And the very fact that they're having to use North Korean troops tells you something, about their own problems. But I think Putin making gradual progress, I think he'll feel the happier of the two at the moment.
I suppose the counter argument would be, and we've had some people on Frontline making this argument recently, is that Vladimir Putin has his own manpower problems. He doesn't want to launch a fresh wave of mobilization because of the potential political risks that could cause him domestically in Russia. He's got his own materiel problems too. And if this war were to drag on towards the end of 2025 or even beyond, some of the underlying weakness of the Russian economy could really cause fundamental problems for him. Do you buy that argument at all?
I don't really buy the argument because, Russia has this ability to take, just tremendous punishment. We saw it in the 1940s, we saw it in the 1950s and the 1960s. And the economic weapon is much more effective against the West than it is against countries like Russia. They can just soak up the pressure. And actually, there are so many holes in the sanctions regime. They're still getting so much money from oil and gas that I think Putin reckon he can weather the storm. And of course, he's so powerful personally, surrounded by the FSB and the military. It's very, very unlikely that he's going to face a challenge to his own authority. And if he does face a challenge, he will put it down, as we saw with the Prigozhin mutiny and so forth. So I don't see. Yeah, Putin's not in a brilliant position. His invasion of Ukraine has been a catastrophe. He's lost vast amounts of men and equipment. It's been a complete mess. But he will reckon that he can outlast Zelensky.
You mentioned the oil and gas revenues that are still sustaining Putin's war effort. Is there not more the West could do to clamp down on, for example, the shadow fleet? Donald Trump, fresh in the White House, he doesn't like the sense that people somehow get around sanctions or tariffs or whatever. In fact, he's threatened to impose new ones. Do you think there's any chance his administration will go, well, look, if this war is going to continue, we need to look again at clamping down on Russia's use of the shadow fleet?
Yes, I think there are all sorts of areas where the West has been incredibly slow. We've been very slow on the shadow fleets. We've been incredibly slow on the undersea defending the undersea cables. But on the question of the pressure on the Russian economy, we have allowed India to import Russian oil now for years. It's been a great boon to the Indian economy. And I think something has changed since Trump's first period in power, which he needs to bear in mind as well. When he was imposing sanctions on Iran back in his first term, he could get China, India, and countries like that to fall into line on that. I think that pass has been sold now. Unfortunately, I don't think China most certainly is not going to honour U.S. sanctions. But I think other countries now, important, second-tier countries, UAE, India, those sort of middle there are no longer really necessarily willing to take diktats from Washington or more generally the West. So I think we have seen a sort of gradual slide in the effectiveness of sanctions. I'm not sure we would ever be able to tighten the noose so tightly around Putin that we force him to a deal that he's not willing to do.
Do you think Europe will ever go back to being dependent, at least in part, on Russian national resources? I mean, I thought it was interesting last week you had the Polish president of the World Economic Forum in Davos coming out saying, we need to make sure that we need to dismantle the Nord Stream pipelines. We need to make sure that Europe, particularly Germany, you sense he was talking about, ever go back to relying on Russian natural resources. Do you think they might, though? Do you fear that Germany might go back in time and rely on Russian resources?
I do indeed. I really fear that if you had a poor deal negotiated between the United States and Russia with Ukraine involved, there was a sort of ceasefire along the lines that people have been suggesting, in which Putin sort of de facto keeps the territory he's won, but not de jure. So you don't officially rewrite the boundaries between the countries. I have a horrible feeling that Europe will do two things. One, it'll say, "Oh well, great, let's start importing Russian gas again." And you're right, but it's not just Germany; it's also Slovakia and Hungary and other countries. And the other thing it will do, it'll say, "Oh well, all that pressure to go up to, is it 2.3 or 3.5 or 5% of GDP on defence? The pressure's off there as well." And I think that is something, and it's good that the President of Poland spoke like that, to try and sort of remind people that we mustn't take the foot off the gas if there is a deal.
On the point about defence spending, I mean, we are having this debate at the moment in the UK with the government having previously made a kind of loose commitment to get to 2.5% of GDP on defence eventually, but being very reluctant to specify a timescale and to stick with the current spending, which is about 2.3. That is a real bone of contention in the UK. Where do you come down on that, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, the real level of defence spending probably needs to be 3.5. I mean, you pick a figure; it's very difficult, and people are bandering around figures up to 5%. But I mean, US spending is 3.4% at the moment, and I think if we were to placate Trump, we in Europe would need to stump up 3.4%. We would need to do the same that they're doing. UK is in a rather odd position because, of course, we have the nuclear deterrent as well. So actually, our figure for conventional warfare is actually only 1.6%, which is why when you compare us with sort of Finland and Poland and so forth, in conventional defence, we are extremely weak. We've got very few tanks, very few aircraft, very, very few ships and submarines. We're poorly placed, really, with our 1.6%, if you look at it that way, of GDP on conventional defence.
Just to go back to how we started this discussion about who needs negotiations more, and I take your point that in your view it is Ukraine, and so maybe Vladimir Putin is not in the mood to make any concessions. But is there not a grave risk for Putin there, that if he is seen, particularly in the eyes of Trump, to be obstinate and not willing to come to the negotiating table, that Donald Trump may do, as the more hawkish members of his administration have suggested, notably General Kellogg, and actually ramp up support for Ukraine?
Yes, that's right. And Putin actually must be a bit alarmed about the things that have happened over the last 2 weeks, really. So, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that he wanted Trump to win the election, of course. And Trump had made a lot in his first term of the rather sort of cozy relationship he had with Kim Jong-un and sort of reasonably with Putin as well. And so he probably would have wanted Trump to come and would think that the chances of getting a reasonably favourable deal were quite high. So I think he must have been quite alarmed by that initial message from Trump, which was actually quite hawkish and quite demanding and quite undiplomatic towards Putin. So, and a lot of people were surprised. Everyone who's assumed that Trump is rather favourable to Putin, rather surprised by the tone of that, and it rather suggests that Zelensky has been having more success with Trump over the last few weeks than we all realised, and maybe other people too, like Maloney, have been making good points as well with Trump. No, so you're right. But the other thing that will worry Trump is all this stuff about Greenland and Canada and Panama. I mean, this is a new US president who is very, very unpredictable at the moment. And every world leader, and including Starmer and Macron and elsewhere, are looking at Trump and thinking, my goodness, how on earth are we going to play, these series of extremely unpredictable actions that he's taking? So Putin, I think, will be more worried than he was on the day that he saw that Trump had won the election.
Yeah, Trump's threats towards Greenland and Canada, for example, and the Panama Canal. I mean, you could almost play it both ways. You could say, on the one hand, if you're the Kremlin, you go, look, now even the Americans are saying it's fine to threaten military exercises to capture foreign sovereign territory. Or you could say, as you just have, Tim, actually it shows that Donald Trump is predictably unpredictable. You don't know what he's going to do next, and therefore we need to be very careful. So I suppose that is particularly interesting. Just on the relationship between Putin and Trump, how would you sum it up? Because there was this sense in the first term, I think it was inaccurate to say that somehow Donald Trump was the poodle of Putin. I think that is massively oversimplifying it. But as you say, there certainly was this sense that Putin would have rather had Trump back in the White House than Kamala Harris. How would you sum up their personal relationship currently?
I don't really know if they have a personal relationship. It's quite difficult as world leaders. You only, in a 4-year term, you only probably have half a dozen, short meetings in the margins of conferences and a few phone calls as well. It's quite difficult to develop a personal relationship. So I'm not quite sure what the personal relationship. I think the aspects of Putinism, if you like, if that is a thing, which Trump rather admires, particularly the anti-woke stuff. I think, and Trump, along with a lot of other right-wing leaders around the world, Giorgia Meloni and others, I think rather approve of that aspect of Putin. So I think there's that aspect. But then I think the other thing that must be a factor is, the humiliating retreat from Afghanistan, which of course everyone's blaming on Biden, but actually, of course, the deal with the Taliban was negotiated by Trump. I don't think Donald Trump wants to be taken again as a sort of sucker, diplomatic sucker. That was a disastrous deal, let's face it. And so the idea of being humiliated by a really bad deal over Ukraine must be a factor weighing with Trump. And then there is another important factor. The narrative had rather gone that the Republicans had deserted Ukraine, but actually there are sufficient Republicans that have not deserted Ukraine. And you mentioned Keith Kellogg is obviously one. Marco Rubio is obviously another. The National Security Advisor is a third. So I think there are reasons to believe that the negotiation between Trump and Putin, which I'm sure will come, is going to be tougher and more evenly balanced than Putin probably dreamed, and that most of us worried about.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode of Frontline. Don't forget you can also now listen to Frontline in podcast form. Just search for The World in 10 from wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also hear daily analysis of the biggest stories relating to war and defence. And we'll put a link to The World in 10 in the description below. Do you think Putin is serious about negotiations currently, though? I mean, I know the message came out from the Kremlin last week in response to Donald Trump's quite hawkish threat to impose new tariffs and taxes and sanctions on Russia if the war doesn't end. And the official Kremlin response was, look, we are ready for negotiations. But in a sense, they had to say that. Do you think they really mean it?
That's a really good question. So I think there are two answers to that, really. One is the point you made at the beginning of this interview, where, yes, Ukraine needs the ceasefire more than Putin does. But still, Putin has taken a huge amount of punishment. And as you rightly say, if he's going to have to start recruiting now from sort of first-tier cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, where it could begin to damage his popularity, then he's going to be reluctant to do so. And with his vast losses, he needs a pause, really. But, we all need to bear in mind in the West, it will be a pause we're talking about. Putin did not invade Ukraine to get 18% of Ukraine. He invaded Ukraine to get, if possible, 100% of Ukraine. That's why he invaded up directly into Kyiv, rather than from the east. So I think so I think that is one point about it. But the other thing is the counter argument to that is so he needs a stop, absolutely. But the counter argument to that is that he's making progress at the moment, and Ukraine is really struggling to find manpower. And I mean, there have been some very interesting reports recently about the poor performance of the new mechanized brigades, which Ukraine has put into the front line. And, it seems like the first cohort of people who joined up in 2022 did extremely well, but they're finding it increasingly difficult to induct new brigades into the front line, and they're not doing so well. So what happens? Putin must think, what happens if I actually break through Ukrainian lines, and suddenly, instead of taking yards each day, we're taking kilometers each day, and suddenly Odessa might even be possible, or Mykolaiv might even be able to link up with Transnistria in the south, or even cross the Dnipro River and start heading into central Ukraine, or even up towards Kyiv. And that would put us, the West, in an incredibly difficult position. Because Trump doesn't want to commit troops to Ukraine. He wants to get out of Europe, He doesn't want to do that. Europe's military is in absolutely no state to intervene in Ukraine, even if it wanted to, with all the implications that might have for escalating the war. So there must be a bit of Putin which thinks, if I keep on pushing, I might actually break through. That, I think, in a sense, is the nightmare scenario.
Just on Ukraine's manpower problems, does it surprise you, Tim, that Zelensky hasn't looked again at lowering the conscription age?
It does. It does surprise me very much, and that surprises me more than the fact that Putin hasn't reached out into his first-tier cities for recruits. Normally when you call up people, you call up young people, and so it is curious. And but I suppose in the back of his mind he must think that would be a very unpopular measure, because it's not just the kids, of course, it's their parents. The fact the war's been going on for 3 years, the fact that people are beginning to wear of it a bit, the fact that some people are beginning to tire a little bit of Zelensky. All of those are factors that must persuade him not to take a measure which, to most people would seem an obvious one.
I think you're absolutely right, Tim, to say, look, Putin's not going to be satisfied with 18% of Ukraine. He wants it all, or he certainly wants a lot more than that. And so, therefore, is it not inevitable that if there is going to be some kind of negotiated settlement, it will have to include some kind of security guarantee for Ukraine, be that NATO membership or something else, not only for Ukraine's security, but for Europe's long-term security, because you can bet your bottom dollar, given the chance, Putin will rearm and go again in 5 to 10 years' time.
Yeah, and of course this is the really, really big problem, which is we have a number of countries, I think I can probably name 5, that would not want Ukraine to have NATO membership. I mean, Hungary, Slovakia, probably Austria, but I think probably most crucially the United States. I mean, Biden was fairly clear that he didn't want, he wanted eventual Ukrainian membership, but nothing imminent. So, to grant Ukraine the paragraph 5, deal that you get with NATO membership, which is that, an attack on one is an attack on all, is a very, very big deal. And I think there are 4, possibly 5 countries not willing to do that. I think Germany is pretty iffy on it as well, incidentally. So that's one of the guarantees off the table, if you like. So then you're now looking at the sort of suboptimal guarantees. And now, if you're Zelensky or Ukraine, you remember the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, which incidentally UK signed, as well as the United States, Russia, and Ukraine. And I'm afraid, we reneged on it. Now, okay, technically you can say it wasn't a guarantee; it was an assurance. And so, if you're Zelensky or Ukraine, you're going to be looking very, very closely at the wording, but more than the wording. I'm not sure if I was Zelensky, I would take a European guarantee seriously. So, if, for example, Trump, as he probably will, say, look, I don't want to provide the troops as a tripwire in Ukraine after some sort of ceasefire deal. That's your job, Europe. So suddenly we have Finns and Swedes and Brits a few Brits, because we don't have a lot of troops, of course, and Poles and French and so forth, monitoring a 1,200-mile border. And the Russians, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, breach it. Do we really believe that Europe is going to go to war? Or will they do a bit like the sort of UNIFIL in Lebanon, which is sort of put their hard hats on and keep their heads down, as I expect they might do. So this is why what Zelensky is saying is, look, if I can't have NATO membership, I must have American troops as part of the tripwire, because he believes the Americans would honour their pledge, although they didn't for the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. So you can really understand why Zelensky and Ukraine are really worried about this question of guarantees. Do guarantees really mean anything? So you could fully understand that Zelensky and Ukraine are going to be very, very cautious about the whole question of guarantees. And that will be the really key moment, I think, in the whole negotiation.
Do you think there is a chance that if Donald Trump is almost presented with this choice of, in order to end the war and come up with a deal that Zelensky is happy to sign, you either need to have US troops policing the buffer zone between Russia and Ukraine, or you need to give NATO membership to Ukraine so that it feels secure, that of those two options, he may actually prefer the NATO option and lobby some of those more skeptical NATO allies to allow Ukraine in, because it's a harder sell maybe for your average middle American to go, I promised to be the man who'd end the war, and now we've got US troops actually in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. I agree with you in that I think he's going to be very reluctant to have US troops in Ukraine, and therefore that'll be a problem. But then that's a big step then to say, well, okay, then in a sense, Ukraine then comes under the United States, nuclear umbrella as well. I think that's a stretch. I mean, that would be a wonderful outcome. Wonderful outcome for Zelensky. Wonderful outcome for Europe. I think Trump might think that's letting Europe off too lightly. I think Trump feels pretty bad about Europe, about our reluctance to even come up to 2% of GDP, or beyond. All those years after that NATO meeting down in Wales, if you remember, where everyone pledged to go up to 2%. I think he's going to want Europe to carry this can, and I think he's going to be pretty tough on Europe as well, to make sure it does.
Yeah, and it's interesting that Zelensky now is kind of jumping on that. And I think last week at Davos, he called out some of the European leaders saying, will Trump even notice Europe? And partly that's designed to almost chide the Europeans, but also to kind of say to Donald Trump, look, I'm on your side. I've got the same grievance as you. We talked about the challenges of getting a deal, Tim. Do you think, therefore, this is still going to be a hot war by the end of this year?
I think they will reach a ceasefire. I think Zelensky needs it. We talked about it earlier. Putin doesn't necessarily need it, but I think it would be welcome in a way. I think the United States wants it. Europe wants it. So I would be pretty surprised with those sort of four motivations if it doesn't happen. I think there is the nagging worry that Putin might just say, well, actually, if you don't mind, I'm just going to carry on. But that's quite a big decision for him to take in the face of everything else, with everybody else saying, come on, Vladimir, let's stop this. Now, the nature of the deal we've talked about already, that's going to be incredibly difficult to negotiate. But I think my money will be on a deal being done this year.
Just finally, do you think the fact that we now have, for the time being at least, a ceasefire in Gaza, does that help the likelihood of getting a deal between Russia and Ukraine? Because if you are President Trump, this is now arguably, well, probably almost certainly is the number one thing in your foreign policy in trade. Maybe the trade relationship with China and the threat to Taiwan is up there as well. But whereas previously it would have probably been Gaza, now Ukraine is back up to number one. Does that increase the chances of a deal?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things there. One was the whole Gaza thing was hugely damaging to the Russia-Ukraine war in terms of removing Western attention from Russia-Ukraine for a period of well over a year. So I think that was very damaging. That's sort of one point. But the second point, I mean, which I suppose in a sense you're touching on, which is would Trump like to be seen as a global peacemaker? I think he would. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Here we have this right wing leader, transactional, unpredictable. Normally, those sorts of leaders one associates with war. But Trump, and to be fair, in his first term as well, made it clear that he wanted to stop wars. And one can speculate about whether he's serious about wanting the Nobel Peace Prize. But this is an unusual man with a touch of vanity, and one wouldn't be entirely surprised. So yes, I think he would look back on year one with the end of the Gaza war. Of course, that's a long way from finished Gaza, of course, and then a temporary peace deal in Ukraine. I think he would regard that as a pretty good first year.
And if he could effectively blunt the threat of Russian expansionism, many would say he would deserve a Nobel Peace Prize.
Absolutely.
Tim, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us again on Frontline.
Great, James. Nice to be with you.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.